I'm about 55 years old, and I'm 55 and a half years old, not about. And I recently, in the last 2 years, I started going back to the gym. I hadn't lifting weights. I had lifted weights so much when I was a young person and just kind of got away from it. And then I started reading, like everyone else. Oh, lift! You need to be able to get yourself up off the ground when you're old. You need to be able to do X, Y, and Z little fitness things. I bring it up because I see a lot of the gym is packed with 20-year-old people, right? And maybe even a few 30-year-olds. A lot of people are in much better shape than 30 years ago when I was doing this on the front end. So, like, it's been optimized, like, we've optimized the gym. So you have it, yeah, I even have an app that tells me what to do every day. I track it all. It goes to whatever server, they're tracking all my data, whatever. But the point is that, like, it optimizes this process for me in a nice way that enables me to think a little bit less in the planning side of it and just kind of go and do it. A lot of what we're seeing now in terms of like the optimization of life has really been focused more on kind of that superficial gym level. Like there's a definite health benefit in exercise and working out and doing some things where you're pushing yourself to kind of be a better person and physically and be more fit. But we never hear about the optimization of friendship. We never hear about the optimization of relationships. Like how do you kind of get the most out of your time with your friends and kind of look at the dynamics between, your group of friends, who's being included or excluded, how does that impact them? Do people feel like they need some one-on-one time to kind of dig a little bit deeper? It's not easy. It's never easy. It's not like these questions and these conversations are simple. But how thoughtful are we being about that when we hear about things like looks maxing, or we hear about like, all the TRT and the HGH and all these different hormones and things that people are ready to order up on their cell phone, or they go to, like, now we have these men's health clinics that have popped up all over the country, which it's great in a certain degree. But like, is it just the optimization of life without the kind of deeper dive into relationships and friendships and kind of building up your social support network? Because yeah, the gym can keep you physically healthy, but what did we learn from that Harvard longevity study? We learned that it's relationships. It's really relationships that keep you going, keep you healthy, keep you alive for a longer period of time, and a much more satisfied life, and I don't want to call it happiness because happiness ebbs and flows, but you can be fulfilled, right? And you can get fulfillment out of a lot of things in your life. And oftentimes it comes down to your relationships.
I'm really glad you said that, and I think I agree wholeheartedly, and I think it points to the approach the healthcare system has had towards understanding health, which is we still approach it from a medical intervention reactive issue standpoint, which is you only go to the doctor once something's wrong. The insurance will only cover something if the medication will cover it or be able to be a treatment as intervention. And I think you're pointing to a more holistic understanding of health. And it's true, right? Like how many guys out there are listening to Huberman Labs, Peter Attia, and it's kind of feels like the 2%, and me
Me
too.
too.
Yeah.
I like that stuff. Yeah.
Which is awesome. But I think to your point, we're spending all these hours, doing that. And do I have the right creatine amount, all that? I think first of all, that can get, very isolated because it's really a small percentage of the average guy is really, let's say, overly consuming that kind of content, which again is good to have that much visibility. But we're kind of like talking about the last 10% of your health, like tweaking there, which to your point about social bonds, we kind of take it back to the bottom of the Maslow's hierarchy of needs triangle and says, like, great, you want to optimize the 10%, you want to look great, you want to get the right supplement intake, totally fair, have a blast. And that feels so small compared to the more accessible and foundational and relatable components of things like social bonding, getting sunlight, getting sleep, all these things that many men are kind of overlooking and either then jumping right to the medication or the supplement or ignoring altogether as being a really crucial part in how we understand health and taking care of ourselves. It's 2014/15, and people are finally saying we need to focus on men's issues. I'm curious, what were some of the alarm bells that couldn't be ignored anymore regarding the state of masculinity?
Yeah, so in 2014, 15, at that point in my career, I was working, I was transitioning from a job in North Carolina to a job up in Washington, D.C. at the Georgetown University. Most of my work had centered on women's reproductive health and working with health departments and ministries of health in sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia to kind of build and test different interventions at health centers in those different countries. And in that context, we were seeing like we were kind of like arriving at points where we were being effective, but to kind of push it over the edge and to kind of bring more women in for those services, whether they were contraceptive services or routine care, PMTCT services, or antenatal care services that are postpartum care services. We realized that integrating men into those programs were going to help to increase the adherence and the the effectiveness of those programs. So, this took a lot of challenges for our space because many of the programs were designed specifically to reach women, and there wasn't a lot of flexibility to kind of bring men into those spaces. The physicians weren't ready, the men very much weren't ready, and mostly the people who were the biggest advocates were oftentimes the wives who were really interested to have their partners more involved in that process, whether it was kind of the lead up to the delivery in the antenatal care space, or it was the postpartum space where they needed a little bit more help at home and to kind of figure out how to get these guys more involved in that space. So in the space where I was working internationally, that was a lot of the way in which we were where we were focused at the time. I think in the U.S., we were also seeing kind of shifts around boys' success in school and things like this that were, kind of just changing the dynamic for boys and trying to figure out how they can better be more successful or be more successful in the school space and educational spaces. So I think it's kind of coming from a number of different angles. And I think now we're at a point where the data is showing us that there was a need to have intervened earlier, but now we have a chance to kind of address some of these issues. So it'll be interesting to see how this evolves in the next 6 to 12 months, but also beyond that over time and see what can be implemented and tracked over time.
Yeah, I'm wondering this common experience that many men are resistant to participating appropriately in their health and the betterment of their health. Seeing that this has been a decade over decade issue, where does that come from in a man's mind? I mean, obviously every man's different in how he's interpreting that, but it does seem to be a very prevalent way of approaching a man's health.
Yeah. So one of the things that comes up a lot in the literature and in the way in which we talk about men and engaging with the health sector has to do with touch points, right? So what are the key touch points for a young man or a boy and engaging in health, right? So for some boys, it's sports and having to have the annual physical to be part of the basketball team or the football team or something else that is requiring your physical fitness to be part of the activity. But that's not for every boy. And it's probably not even for half of the boys. Like a lot of boys kind of lose that, other than an annual checkup that their mom drags them to or something like this. They don't typically have that kind of touch point with the health sector. So there is that kind of structural dynamic that comes into play. And when you look at the research, there was one of the colleagues of mine at Johns Hopkins, Eric Marcel. He did some research around like looking at boys and their kind of engagement with the health sector through adolescence and later adolescence. And you lose these kids when they're about 14 or 15, and sometimes they don't go back to the doctor until they absolutely have to, or they go to like an urgent care clinic rather than going to a primary care clinic where they have that interpersonal or the personal relationship with that physician or provider. It's much different for girls because when girls have a menstruation, potentially using contraception, which is much more, there are male contraceptive methods, but there's not the variety and they also are applied much differently, right? So when we think about this, there's like that structural dynamic where boys don't have the frequency of interaction with the health system, and also elements around that kind of like, you know, what is it that's bringing you in, right? So if it's you, one of the things when I give talks very often, if it's a mixed room, I'll ask the room, if you've ever gone to a physician and the physician has talked to you about family planning and reproductive health, raise your hand. And you'll notice that in a room of 50-50 room of men and women, you'll have all the women raise their hand, but maybe one or two of the men will raise their hand. And usually they're older guys like me, and they've had a vasectomy and they've kind of been through this kind of process as an older man. But when a woman goes into the doctor's office, if she's gone in for a sprained ankle or she's fallen and hurt herself in another way, um, it's not uncommon for a doctor to ask, okay, when was your last period? Are you trying to get pregnant? If they say no, they'll ask questions like, are you using a contraceptive? Which one? And think about those questions for a second. If you've fallen and you hurt your ankle, you can have a conversation about the ankle and the fall and all those things. And that's kind of a surface level conversation. But when you have a conversation about your period, your decision about whether or not to get pregnant, a medical device that you're using or medicine you're using, you're really talking about super intimate things. And so it creates a different dynamic for women and we're only talking structurally at this point, like creates a different dynamic for women structurally. And for men, you don't get those questions. I mean, if you and I go into the doctor's office and we could have a broken ankle or something, it's well, what did you do? How did you hurt yourself? That kind of thing. They'll ask that same question, but they may very well follow up with those other personal, like reproductive health questions for women. And that's integrated into the health system. And then beyond that, you have this dynamic. It just came out in the one of the really interesting. I actually just put out a blog on it today. This dynamic around how men perceive other men and kind of care and kind of seeking and showing vulnerability, right? So many men will report that they feel it's okay for men to share their vulnerability, their questions, or they're not feeling strong about a certain thing or even like needing to seek care. But when they ask them, what do other men think about that? That same person who, if I say, oh, yeah, I think men should be able to share their vulnerabilities with their friends, but they'll say, other guys don't think that. And so we have this kind of gap, and it's kind of like a check on our own honesty in a way. Like, can we be honest about our vulnerability? Can we be honest about what makes us sad or what, the challenges we're facing in life? Because we don't want to show those dynamics to other guys. Oftentimes, some researchers will talk about it as though vulnerability or sensitivity or even sickness is viewed as a female trait. It's kind of a flaw in your male, a kink in your armor of sorts, right? And it's really interesting because everybody gets sick. Everybody has challenges. Everybody kind of goes through the same series of problems and to a greater or lesser degree, right? And you always need somebody to process that with. And one of the questions in that section, I put it actually put the full figure in the blog. It's figure 13 in that report from Movember is around, should you be able to talk to your friends about the things that are concerning you? And there's that disparity that exists. So they want to talk about it, but they're kind of checking on them. There's like a check on themselves to stop them from talking about it. So, I mean, I do it. You probably do it. It's not like I'm sitting here telling you I know I'm immune to this myself because I've done it. I've probably done it in the last week too, kind of not sharing everything with everybody. Yeah. Yeah. It's an interesting kind of dynamic, but it limits you from going when you think other people are watching you and limiting and judging your decision to go to the doctors. It might keep you from actually going to the doctors, delaying healthcare. And what we know about the health outcomes is that, yes, men go less frequently and they delay health seeking activities longer than women typically do, right? So some men that's why we have worse outcomes when it comes to things like cancer. Men will show and they'll present for cancer at a much later stage on average. Not every man, but sometimes on average. So failing to seek preventative care, failure to report when they notice something wrong in their body, they'll hold it back. Some women do that too, and some guys don't do this, but on average, it's more likely for men to do it.
Yeah. Thanks for giving us that breakdown. And something you said that had immediately come to mind is that sense of over self-reliance and this ignorant question like, well, why do I need to go to the doctor? Like nothing's wrong. And I think that question embodies so much of how many men see themselves, which is essentially, unless something is on fire, very obviously just broken, why would I proactively care for myself? And I think it's a really dysfunctional approach because it's not proactive, it's reactive. And ultimately, it's a very low sense of self worth and value towards your body and your overall life. And I think that your second point about women being asked that question, I think you're right. It's just as important for a man to ask that question, especially from the side of like understanding the weight of what it means to sexually engage with someone, which for a female, they're going into those situations knowing, which is why the doctor has to ask, right? Like because they're biologically more responsible after, those acts happen. And I think many men need to be more in check. And then, especially if they're in a committed relationship, slash married, optimally, right? And you're thinking about having kids, your, quality sperm and how you're taking care of yourself, how you're supporting your wife, to some of those things you mentioned of why these studies started to begin with, are vital for men to know and consider. Many of them aren't even asking those questions. Um,
Yeah. It's interesting too because you have like a so many forces kind of weighing down on your decisions as a guy to have sex as a young, like maybe high school or college age kid, and whether it's casual sex that doesn't lead to a relationship or it's within a relationship itself. Who's modeling these things for you? Who are the people that talk about sex to you? Are they your parents? Are they people you trust? Are they accurately informed? Like a lot of people have super, like even my own parents had, my mom had like, misinformation about reproductive health that I later joked with her about, as I got into this field. And I didn't, there were a lot of things I didn't know that I learned as I got into the space of reproductive health and international health, as like anything. But I think it's really important to kind of think it through in terms of, these decisions aren't made in a vacuum. The kids make these, young people make these decisions, old people make decisions too, like with the various pressures and expectations that they put on themselves to be kind of sexually promiscuous or to be successful sexually as like a viable candidate for somebody's love and affection, or as a, as a partner. And like, how do they kind of view that? How do they talk about it? Are they able to be consistent across, their own expectations and with their partner and communicating goals and objectives in terms of like their relationship, right? Because, we, it's there's a lot to it, but it's really kind of, at the end of the day, it comes down to communication and being able to articulate your expectations. And a lot of guys never really even question that either. Some of the research we had done in sub-Saharan Africa, and I will admit my own complicity with this mindset, was like I never really thought about like how many kids I was going to have when I was in high school or college or even after college. I thought, yeah, kids may happen someday. But I also never remember having a conversation with friends who were like, okay, I want to have two kids and I want to have two boys, Jonathan and Jacob, and that's just the way it's going to be. But I have a family member who later on, after I got married and stuff, that's what he said. He said, I'm going to have two kids, Jonathan and Jacob. And lo and behold, the guy actually had two boys. He had a Jonathan and Jacob. But the point is that, you know, it's interesting because, we were having that conversation. We were both married, both in this in-laws, and I think he had already had Jacob at the time. But the point is like, he had an idea as to what he wanted. A lot of guys go into this without that idea and not with a normalized conversation about it with their friends. Like, I mean, I'm not going to put you on the spot, but I can tell you from my own experience, I had never really had a conversation like, well, I want to have kids when I get older. Marriage was kind of like, yeah, probably kind of thing. So it's an important thing to think about when you think about the way in which men and women have to come together, and they're coming together with such different kind of scripts and expectations and kind of understandings as to what and how it all works.
Yeah. You know what I think you're getting at there is something really important for a man to have is a life vision, to have some sense of what are you aiming towards. And it's not that this guy that, is a prophet and it's like, oh, wow, look at him. He predicted and it happened. It's more of just having a general sense of intentionality to say, like, this is such a powerful act of reproduction. And me and my partner, it's such a radical life-changing force that, really impacts the dynamic of you as an individual and you collectively as a couple. And it's worth thinking through, my experience, I think, because I did grow up in a more conservative family, I think that was more normalized. And not to say that, people based on political ideologies are more considered or less. This is just my experience. Having a family was just more kind of not matter of fact, but it was kind of subtly expected, right? Just like education of going to college. So I kind of had put forth that when I was dating my wife, and that was a really helpful factor and something I use in therapy with guys. Like, have an idea. Do you want kids? Do you not? If so, in general, how many? And communicating that. And then I think to the second point, you said this earlier, is, that's on the front end of stuff. But then when it comes to health, there's so many things that guys struggle with, after they find a partner: with erectile dysfunction, miscarriages, and they're not talking to each other, they're not talking to the doctor about it, and many of them are suffering in silence. And it's like, man, these are real issues, to your point, that we need to be more normalized in sharing everything from, do you want kids, how many, to sharing that with your buddies, to, hey man, we've been trying and it's been really tough, which I think, again, women a little bit more naturally share with each other, and have that space to support each other. And obviously biologically, for a woman, some of those things are more intense or immediately felt, but nonetheless, I think we need to continue to create a space for men to talk about these things.
Right. Or the GLP-1 or whatever else it is, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's also one of those things where, it's not easy. And every time so what did they call it? Kind of the great lock-in. Have you heard about this concept of the great lock-in? So around the beginning of September, I started to see online this notion of the great lock-in. And this is the idea that, like, instead of starting a New Year's resolution on January 1st, you would start at September 1st, and that would, or maybe it was October 1st, maybe it was September 1st, let's say. I can't remember the exact details, but I had written a blog after I saw it. I wrote a blog about it, about, okay, let's lock in, but let's lock in and let's figure out how to put relationships into that lock in. Because if part of it is like, you want to create a resolution, you want to stick to it, you want to kind of do the self-improvement element, right? Which is great, whether it's physical or professional or family wise, but you'll get so much more out of that lock-in and from that experience if you can integrate people into the process that you have to talk about what you're doing and achieving and challenged with, and you are listening to them and also getting, kind of the fulfillment of value that you're adding to somebody else, right? So, like, being able to talk to somebody and share your problems is one thing, but being able to listen deeply to someone else's problems and to actually be acknowledged for that, whether it's direct acknowledgement or it's even like just somebody, even like you knowing that they appreciated that moment of your attention and your focus, is fulfilling. That fills the cup, right? So that helps to fill the cup, not just the elements around the gym and not just I'm going to lock in and I'm going to learn French by January 1st or whatever, whatever your thing is, right? But it's one of those experiences where if you share that with other people in a really kind of pro-social way, it's even that much better. And I give some examples in the blog of, like, you know, uh, okay, so you have a fitness lock-in, right? Like, you're locked in to prep for a January marathon, or you're going to try to run Boston in April, right? And the thing is, like, maybe you got to raise some money, and you could do that with a partner or a group of people, and you find out and kind of share the goal together. Or you could do things where you're kind of filtering in like a once a week group run, where we know group runs right now are really big and popular, especially here. I see them all the time. Tonight I'll go to the gym and I'll cut through town. I know once I go through the Ballston area of Arlington, Virginia, I'll see 3 or 4 big running groups. Hopefully they catch the light before I do. But, it's one of those things where you're starting to see more of that: running clubs, running groups, that kind of thing. People using the physical activity as a social opportunity. I'm a big hiker. I love to hike and do things like just kind of, how do you bring somebody along? It doesn't have to be every workout, but maybe once a week, maybe every other week. Maybe you have somebody who you share some kind of like shared documentation about whatever your goal or objective, back to that optimization thing. How do you share that with other people in a really pro-social way that's not competitive, right? Because the competition thing gets a little bit weird too, right? But how are you doing it with somebody who's like, maybe their lock-in is around, like, for the bad example, the French language, and yours is more physical. And you're just kind of checking in with each other to kind of ask how it's going. And then bringing in other elements of your life that make it hard or easy, what facilitated my gym time, what facilitated my study time, that kind of thing. And just kind of keeping that in mind because I do feel like we have gotten to a point where, and I'm super guilty of this too, we have goals, we have objectives, we have responsibilities, and just kind of when we focus on only those things, it's kind of you just kind of leave yourself loose. You kind of don't really have a way to I often feel disconnected. I'm a pretty social person too, so that it's a little bit challenging for me. I've
Yeah.
recently developed this group of guys where we have Friday morning coffee. Like this morning, I went in and we all had coffee at a coffee shop down in the Clarendon area here. And the point of mentioning it is that like these guys really go out of their way. Like these are high level professional people, and they go out of their way to make this coffee, even if they pop in for 15 minutes, because everybody gets something out of it, right? And it just kind of makes it's a big kind of like opportunity to just even be seen for a minute or to see other people for a minute. And maybe you make plans, maybe you don't, or many of our wives are kind of friendly too. So, but we never get that kind of moment, just the guys. So,
Yeah.
it's been a nice little way to check in. But that lock in, kind of being pro-social, being relational, that kind of thing
Yeah.
is really key.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that. When I moved to Boston with my wife, she was from here already, so had a semi-established friend group. But for me, I had my in-laws, which is always an incentive to make new friends in
Yeah.
addition to that. But so I started going to the YMCA, and I met an abnormally high amount of friends in the sauna, of all places. And now we start hanging out, and then from that, I realized you had mentioned this. I think it's a great way to approach it. Is that instead of just thinking when I do something that's beneficial for me, an isolated incident like going to the gym, what if I saw that as a form of social bonding, aka the run clubs? So I started doing that. I actually started a group of guys running biweekly on Saturday mornings, and it's just a time for us to get together, and it's awesome. My younger brother-in-law comes. There's like guys that I don't know that well who are friends of friends, right? And it's just so cool to see us all interact. And it's not like we're having super deep conversations, but to your point about going out of the way, it feels like a touch point, and it feels like really meaningful time to spend together. Speaking of the topic of friendship, you mentioned that making male friends as an adult is scarier than asking a girl on a date, which I love when you said that. And it's totally true. I had a guest on months ago who said one of the most awkward moments in a guy's life is asking for another guy's phone number.
Uh,
And I
uh,
find, hey, I think that's true. So, what does friendship actually look like also across different life stages, right? Because asking a guy to hang out when you're 23, recently graduated, and going out and drinking, every weekend
mhm.
feels completely different than someone like myself, 33, with a kid and one on the way, or you in your 50s, and in a different life stage as well.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that, like, so many of my friends here in our so I've gone through those stages where, I'm from Central Massachusetts, not too far from where you are, as you know, and the people I'm probably most in touch with are those guys I went to high school with. So like that sense provincial, but none of them live in that same town anymore. We've all kind of like, and we meet each other in California, or we meet each other on Cape Cod, or we meet each other down here at my place or someplace else. And it's like one of those things that's been a real treat to kind of experience parts of the country with these different people as well. So I did keep that and like historical kind of relationships, I've kept them intact. As I got through your phase of life, and then I moved overseas for a while. So I was in Ethiopia for a couple of years, and friendships were different because it was cross cultural, and it was also, there were a lot of barriers, but there were also a lot of facilitators because of the uniqueness that I brought to the room and the uniqueness that they brought to me when we had these kind of dynamics. But as I had children, the first couple years of having children can be extremely isolating, right? So like, because the kids are super intense, there's a lot of work to be done. A lot of driving around, you got car seats and all that other kind of baloney and diapers and all that stuff. And you never think you can kind of get away from it, right? Unless you're fortunate to have family nearby or somebody to help or financially able to get a babysitter, and you have a reliable babysitter too, because that's never that helpful. But the thing is that, as I got the kids get older, you start to also notice that you can create social networks through the children. And this is where every one of the except for one guy who only has boys, all the other guys, because I have two daughters, we met from basketball that my younger daughter was playing. So this is a network of guys that kind of started, like the core of them all started from that relationship through the basketball practices and us standing on the side just shooting the shit, just laughing or like watch this, and kind of doing something stupid. But the thing is like it, eventually you find the people with the same kind of mentality and kind of joking the same way or kind of laughing at the same things. And to get at that, like what I find now as I'm a little bit older is that I'm around a lot of younger people. And I wouldn't necessarily assume a role of a mentor, but I do kind of notice that I have people who come and reach out to me to just to talk and to hear more about the work I've done or to bounce something off of me. And I appreciate that because it's like they bring something to my life in a different way because of their kind of perspective and experience is much different than my experience. And what I do to kind of foster that is I follow up. So like the follow up is really a critical element of all of this, right? So if you've had a phone call or you've talked to somebody, you say like, "Hey, I really appreciate you reaching out. I was really curious to see where are you with that project? What's happening? Give me an update." It doesn't have to be a long email even. It could be 2, 3 sentences. It really matters because they appreciate the time you spent with them on the front end and the fact that you care, right? And something I started to do a couple years ago. So like I have a group. I lived in North Carolina for a long time. I've been here for 10 years. And the point is like I've had friend groups from each of these places and back home and all this kind of stuff in Ethiopia. I even lived in Saudi for a little bit and all this kind of stuff. But the thing is, when you hear from somebody, I like to err on the side of politeness and I say, "Hey, thanks for reaching out," or "It's good to hear from you. I was thinking about you," or something like this. Yeah, sure, you might be uncomfortable the first couple times, but then eventually who gives a shit, right? No, if someone's judging you because you say, "I appreciate you reaching out," then you need to rethink that relationship. But the point is that, like, as you do that, what you're really doing is you're building up kind of like a level of intimacy and trust, right? Because when you admit to somebody like, "Hey, you did this and this is how it made me feel thankful," that's pretty valuable, right? So that's got a lot of value. Even if it's "Hey, thanks, I appreciate that." That has a huge value in terms of building a relationship. And, it just I try to do that as much as I can. And I noticed that over time, it kind of happens on the back end too. So yeah, I think as an older person, kind of you can still make friends, and I feel like I do, but it's some of those tricks are really helpful. And I will tell you, I worked in the space that I've worked in for the last 20 years, and literally until the last year, 99% of the meetings I was in, I was either the only man or I was one of very few men in the room. And so when you work on reproductive health at an international level, the room is women. And so it changes like the way you even see yourself in that space is different because you're seeing yourself as an outsider and you don't have all the power and you don't have all maybe you have a certain level of power, but there's somebody who's the boss in the room that's probably a woman. And so it's an impactful kind of reality of my professional career. And I've learned a lot from a lot of the women that I've worked with, and I'm very grateful to their patience with me at some points too, when it comes to a lot of that stuff. But it's a very important space to kind of like recognize that I've had this whole career of research and had female bosses the entire time.
Yeah, I relate to that. A therapist and being one of the few guys in the room. And yeah, that's right. We learn so much from our female counterparts in a way that is really necessary. And, when you were talking about some of the key tools that we can use to be effective in friendships, it reminded me of something that happened yesterday. I walked in the kitchen, I saw my wife and she was texting a friend, and all I said was, "What are you doing?" And she goes, "Oh, I'm sending, so and so to a miss you text. A miss you text. I was like, what's that? And I just realized, oh my goodness, yeah, my wife, if she goes a certain period of time without hearing from a friend, she doesn't assume they don't want to talk to me. She, blah blah blah. But she also is like, something needs to change. I'll at least just express that I miss you and I'd love to catch up soon. And I sat with that and it made me feel slightly uncomfortable. And it was challenging because I thought, okay, what if I send, thinking my buddy Chris, I'm just going to
Yeah,
send, hey man, I miss you. And I have done it before, but I think it speaks to our need to normalize healthy emotion expression towards each other in that care. And it's like, hey man, I miss you. And I love that breakdown you gave about kind of the formalities of really, but the intentionality of saying things like, thanks for reaching out. You're expressing an emotion towards that person and sharing a positive impact they had on you. And that tiny little sentence, and the one that I hope I don't hear anymore, I hope all is well with you. It's just
yeah,
like,
yeah, yeah,
but if we take that serious, you're right, it does speak to a deeper sense of care. And I think in a similar way as Mim, that is a core part of us building and maintaining friendships is continually expressing that. And you're right. If I think through if a buddy reaches out, hey, it's been a while, man, miss you, let's catch up. That means so much. I don't think right away I'm a terrible friend. I don't think they don't like me. I don't, blah, blah,
yeah,
blah. All that just goes out the window and I'm immediately like, man, I love him. Like, I'm so glad. To me, want to be incentivized to reach back out. And I think you brought up a final point that guys really need to consider is if you try that and your buddies make fun of you, they're really resistant to you doing it, they make fun of it, and they actually try to kind of ostracize you for doing that, they're not good friends and they're not mature and you don't need them in your life. And there are many men out there, thank God, that are starting to mature more and normalize that will do that. Now, the cost is loneliness because you're going to be around less people because you're choosing quality over quantity, but it is possible. It just takes some effort and using tools and knowing how to express yourself and being confident in that.
yeah, and it also you can come with the weapons, right? So, like, if you're gonna put it out there and you say something to the effect of, you know, several of my friends, not all of them, but several of my friends will finish a phone call with "I love you," and if somebody's like, "Oh, that's gay," or whatever they're gonna say to you, many friends are still I'm 55 years old and they still say that shit. And it's one of those things where, you can say, Why does that we're 55 years old, why does that make you uncomfortable?" I mean, or you can say like, "Is that what are you, 14?" You say something like that. You be ready with some zingers you can hit them with and say, why is this, why is this a problem for you? You can kind of to that extent, like that's the goal of it. And just ask them to kind of think more about it. I know, for example, there are people that also, everybody probably has people in their lives who have a hard time with emotions and I watch Hallmark. The Olympics are the worst for me. When I see these kids go up and they get their medal and they national anthem and all that kind of stuff, I'm like, oh, I cry every time. But the point is like, some people aren't good with like, showing any emotion, right? And like recently I had a big kind of job dynamic where, everything shifted. When USAID went under and they cut USAID, I basically lost my job. I had to like rebuild my whole career. And in months, I mean, like I had a deadline, like a Dominic, you are not going to be employed by Johns Hopkins as of this date. And I have like six tiny jobs, but I really have like, and I'm still at the university. I have all these little things, but I lost a lot of money. I lost a lot of time. I was super anxious. And I had a handful of guys that checked in on me on a regular basis. They checked on me every week, or they'd shoot me a text, or they'd do something, right? Then I had a couple of the old school guys I didn't hear shit from, nothing. And it was a moment where I was kind of like valuing one person over another person, right? So like these guys who checked in on me, priorities, right? Like these are my priority people. But these guys who didn't check in on me, and I've checked in on them in the past when things have been tough for them, I kind of like, I'm gonna wait. I'm not gonna shut them out. I'm just gonna wait. And there have been other friends who've done things that I've gotten pretty upset about too. But like with these guys who didn't check in on me on this situation, and they were well aware of my dynamics, but I just kind of waited and I waited. And then I also noticed that, like, when I did eventually talk to those guys, it wasn't personal. It's just some people literally just don't have the capacity to do it. And they've never been trained. They've never had somebody do it for them. They've been reliant on their wife to be their emotional crutch their entire life. And like, they just don't have that capacity. And so I I I really went through a moment of this, like, literally within the last 2 weeks, and I got one friend who calls me, he does, like, this volunteer work once a week, and he has to drive for, like, 45 minutes dropping off food at all these different places around the San Francisco Bay Area, and he always calls me, and I tell him some kinda I stop what I'm doing, and tell him some stupid shit, and he listens, and we laugh and whatever, but, I was telling him about this one dynamic, and while I hadn't heard from this guy, and it was, like, trying to make a plan for a weekend and this and that, and he's like, "Ah, yeah, it'll work out." You know, it's just, just kind of like, just sit with it. It'll work itself out. These are good people. They're not bad people. It's just some people just don't have the capacity. And if you can't surround yourself with one type of person either, you have to have at least I do. I have to have a lot of variety. But
Yeah.
get back to the check-ins though, that kind of check-in your wife did, that was so awesome. It doesn't have to be, it can be, dude, I have some friends who are like music friends. I have some friends who are like sports friends. I have other friends who are a little of both. I have other friends who are like jokey joke friends, like that kind of stuff. And I like to, like, when I go to the gym is when I really listen to a lot of music because nobody talks to each other in the gym anymore. Everybody's got these things in and they're like, whatever. But I like to listen to a lot of music, and if I get something old school or if I get something like, something new that I think somebody might like, I'll either screenshot it or I'll forward it over to them through, like, I use Apple, so Apple Music or whatever. And it just, hey, I was listening to this, think you might like it. You may never hear nothing back. Your expectation should be low. But what you've done is you've at least kind of kept the line of communication open, or like getting like a meme or even like uh, I have one friend who he and I played basketball together in college. And, it's one of those things where I'll send him like a fucking killer dunk, or I'll send him some sort of like, some sort of play, Celtics play or whatever. And, just to kind of keep the line of communication open. And that's really like it doesn't have to be super thoughtful because you've already had the thought. You're looking at that and you're probably thinking about that person anyway. So why not just put it in that's the phones have fucked us up in so many ways. Why not use it in that one pro-social way that you can use it and maximize even that little, and if they don't come back to you, yeah, I'm on text threads there's this one text thread I'm in. It's 4 guys and 2 of us are talking the whole time. And so I talked to the other 2 guys here and there, and I said, one guy's like, "Well, I read all the texts. He's just not a texter." And that's what he says. And the other guy's like, "Yeah, but I don't feel comfortable texting and da 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 da." And I said, "Just start sending some messages. I don't give a shit what you write. Just write it, you know." And so he started texting a little. He sent just some stupid stuff. He's on different platforms than we're on, and that kind of stuff. So you can have people that are just kind of like in the periphery. Not everybody's going to be as front and forward, but it's really important to kind of recognize that about your friends too. Like, who are they?
Yeah.
And, try to drag them along when you can, just
Yeah.
drag them.
No,
So,
you do make a good point. I tend to be a little all or nothing sometimes, but I do have friends like that, and I think it's important, to your point, to have a variety of different types of friends. What do you connect on in different ways? I also, have friends that I watch college football with, and some that I get really deep and have personal, more sentimental conversations with. I have dad friendships. I have spiritual friends. All that, and then within that variance, there's also a variance of depth that, every guy carries. And the important thing is it would actually be weird if you had 20 guys you were super deep with. You actually
right.
can't do that, right? So it's
No.
like who's your core that you go deep with, and then who is kind of that second level, who's the third level. But essentially it should be, yeah, a robust and varied group of friends. And but we're still at the point where it's, the average guy is 0 to 1.
Yeah.
And that data point, leads me to this last question I'm really curious about asking you is, when you look at the data on male suicides, substance abuse, academic performance, male loneliness, all the things, how is masculinity being practiced every day in a way that's contributing to these outcomes? And then I have some questions on the research you've done at the American Institute for Boys and Men.
Yeah. So I'm still learning a lot about suicide, right? And some of the things that have really been most interesting to me are around like, the rates are very incredible. I've had friends who've committed suicide. I've had a couple friends. I had a really close friend from elementary school who, as we got to high school, we kind of went separate ways. But when I saw him, it was like, Craig, how you doing? Hugs and all that kind of stuff. And he went through a hard time. And he had a child, and he had some dynamics. The last time I had seen him, he was doing some serious drugs and like doing a lot of drinking. And I bumped into him in a bar back in Fitchburg, and I was like, he was telling me his story, and it just sounded awful. And then I was actually leaving the country at that point, and while I was abroad, I found out that he had committed suicide. The point in bringing him up is like, did he have somebody to turn to in that moment? Did he have somebody to kind of like confide in and tell him like, yeah, this sucks. This situation is awful, but it's going to work out. We're here to help you, that kind of thing. I don't know. I don't know. Did he have that context? And then also like what I did learn about this dynamic around men and suicide is oftentimes it's a very impulsive decision. It's a decision that, yes, they may have been thinking about it, but the actual act is oftentimes incredibly impulsive. And so if they don't have people around them, I mean, and this maybe there might be more research for me to learn about too. So this is not, you know, I'm new to this space a bit, but oftentimes that impulsive decision kind of takes them to an extreme because they are making this suicidal act that is it's lethal. It's not like, oftentimes the guns or something extremely fatal. And so, you don't know. It kind of like leads me to kind of remember like sometimes when you don't have the full faculty and range of emotions to kind of go through, and you go from like maybe woe is me to like I have to end this, that's a big jump, right? And that's a big jump that talks about the kind of like your emotional capacity to kind of manage the feelings, the physical feelings, and understand that there are ways to kind of subside that aren't drugs and alcohol that could potentially be more pro-social and bring you to interactions with other people. And I feel like, I need to learn a bit more about this as well in terms of suicide and men. But I do feel like, because we don't kind of have these opportunities to kind of open ourselves up to each other, or we bring a lot of shame and stigma. There's a lot of stigma around these kind of dynamics, or even stigma to go seek a healthcare provider. That's a challenge. In this new Movember report around, it's a really comprehensive report, and it's maybe something you could link in the notes of this podcast. They talk about how men who do go to mental health care, there's a section in there that focuses on health-seeking behaviors, and how oftentimes when men do seek mental health service providers, they leave unsatisfied. They don't feel heard. They don't feel listened to. Now, that could be the provider. That could be a provider based. It could also be a situation where, for some guys, the whole conversation of therapy is just, it's like going to Mars, I mean, that is like, I mean, you are a practicing therapist. I mean, you must see men who come into the room and are just completely unprepared for having any of these conversations and want to talk about football or work or kids just in a very surface level, super, 10,000 foot level, rather than my kid is doing this and I feel this way. Right. So, why are these men discouraged in that context? Most importantly, until society changes, which will happen slowly and maybe never, the therapists have to figure out how to kind of get in and how to kind of connect in a way that brings these guys back and back and back to their sessions. And so that's really the biggest challenge, is that, I don't want to say not having a good therapist leads to suicide. That's not what I'm saying. But I think some of the tools that we have to avoid suicide could be modified and improved to kind of reach men in a more effective way. But there is a section in that report that talks about specifically those, and I'm sorry I can't cite the statistics for you, but there's a good section that kind of reflects how many men are dissatisfied with the mental health services that they've sought out. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that. I had a conversation on this podcast with Matt Engler Carlson. He was a previous president of APA Division 51, and he is a therapist himself. And for anyone listening, go check out that episode because it was really insightful. He broke down the psychology of men coming to therapy, everything from how most therapy rooms look more feminine, all the way to the language we use, to the way that we approach. And I think that's right. I think many guys, they're not only coming ill prepared to talk and then feel overwhelmed, but they also don't feel very known. It doesn't feel very accessible. A lot of times they feel like they're dragged to it. And, that's just the reality. Some as a research fellow under Richard Reeves at the American Institute for Boys and Men, what's one or two main things that men ages 18 to 35, let's call them, young professionals, most need to take action on right now? Or what are some other insights that you found in your work that you feel like is worth naming?
Yeah, I do feel like the friendship dynamic is really central to this because, there's plenty of research around the dynamics around as you age. One of the things about that's nice about school is you track through school together. Like hopefully hopefully you feel comfortable with your cohort. But the reason why we call them a cohort is because they're going through this experience together, right? So you hit many biological markers together, many social markers together, many kind of like intelligence and knowledge development markers together. And so, you're all experiencing the same science test and you're all going to the same dance and you're all kind of maybe seeing the same movies and talking about the same ball games. And the point what that does is it kind of gives you place and context, right? And that's really key. And as you get older, you lose that place and context to a large extent, which is why when we started talking earlier, we talked about friendship and as, a place to kind of find home in other people and find that kind of like, the dynamics around, your relationship and being able to find yourself in relationships with other people. And so as you go to college, you fracture. Maybe you go to college with one or two people you went to high school with, maybe with nobody. Then you make a new cohort of friends and you go through the college experience together, or you get your first job and you go through that first job experience together. And then eventually that job ends. So you go to a different job, something else happens and it keeps fracturing. And when you think about how, you go through that experience, if you're not maintaining those links back to the people that you had those previous experiences with, yeah, you're going to change. You're going to be a different person in 10 or 15 years, but you still remember those people and you still shared that moment with them. And so, hopefully it was positive in the sense that you can go back and you can reconnect and kind of keep even a small line of communication open. And I think that, that's why I think friendships is so critical because as you get older, you only have fewer and fewer friends. And it's because you don't share those same experiences in the same ways. Some of my friends I have one daughter who's a junior in college, and I have a daughter who's a senior in high school. So many of my friends have a daughter or a child who's a senior in high school. Okay. And then some of my friends have several older children, and some of my friends have several younger children. So, like, we share a child in this age bracket, and that's brought us together in a way. But, really, they also have these other kind of connections and other, linkages to other people. And so we all don't do the same kind of work, so like are you building the relationships where the relationships can happen and you can kind of reconnect with people on even if it's the gym and you see the same person at the gym. My wife jokes like when we travel, we went to Hawaii a couple of years ago. We went for 2 weeks. 2 weeks in Hawaii. Fuck yeah. That's amazing. And we didn't go to like and some people might not like, I mean, this is our 20th anniversary. And the thing is that, we had gone on our honeymoon to Hawaii. So we went to Hawaii in the 20th anniversary and we brought the kids. And I said, I don't want to go to the other islands. I just want to go to Kauai, which is the smallest island, right? And it's really, you can drive all the way around the island and like, you can't even drive all the way around the island. You can go from like 12 o'clock to 8 o'clock or something like that. And the point is that, I said, I just want to go to one place. And by the end of the week, I want to know the name of the person I buy my coffee from every day. I want to know who's sitting at the bar. And I want to go to the same beach a few times. I don't want to go to a different beach every day. There's going to be a beach that I love and I want to go back there. And so we saw and that's how it went. You know, there are other vacations where you might go 1,000 places and do all this kind of stuff. But for that vacation, that was what I wanted because I wanted that consistency and I wanted that kind of, ability to kind of wake up and be like, okay, we're going to do this today. It might be a little boring for some people, but you can drive away and go do whatever you want to do. So the point is that like you have opportunities to make connections and consistency, and you're kind of going and being in the same place with people at the same time. Do you ever think about that weird moment like you go to the gym and you see the same you say you go at 4:30 every day or 6:30 or whatever your time is, and then you go to Whole Foods or you go to like Giant or Stop and Shop up in Boston, and you're like, how do I know that person? Oh, that's the guy. He's always at the gym at the same time I'm at the gym. Not that you're gonna go and up, you're not there. I'm not saying like go and accost the person and start talking to him or anything, but like there's a value in kind of seeing that person, even if you don't really talk to that person, right? Hopefully you don't have your headphones in at the Stop and Shop, but you definitely you recognize each other in that context, right? So for me, I think a lot of the things around men, their mental health, their physical health, it's around being around people who kind of creating relationships and creating opportunities to connect with other people. And I also think that, a lot of the things around men, and I focus on health. I think a lot of it is preparing the health sector to be ready to receive men in the health sector. Mental health is one thing, but also even in physical, like the doctor's office, and being more prepared to not just, what are the things they say in this Movember report that we've been saying for a long time, and it came out in the Surgeon General's report a couple of years ago around loneliness, is this reality that in a clinical setting, they should both be talking to the men about their rolled ankle or whatever's brought them in, their ailment, but they should also be asking them questions around their connectivity, their relationships, their friendships. What do they have and what's happening in their life that's enabling them to kind of persevere with social support and with the social support network. So I think the health sector really needs to kind of re-examine how men's health is implemented. And there are studies, even like, one of the people, Zach Seidler, is one of the top people at Movember and is main author on a lot of their papers. He had written a paper a few years ago where what he did was he examined the what do you call it, the curriculum for physicians in the top medical schools in all of Australia. So he looked at like let's say the 20 top medical schools, and he looked at all the courses, and he looked at how many courses actually focus on men and men's health issues specifically. And I think the number was zero point 0.8. That's how often that came up. So if you think about it, there's an OBGYN division. There's not really a men's health division in a lot of spaces, right? I actually, after I read that, I went and I looked at the curriculum. I looked at all the course offerings at Hopkins, and one of the top medical schools in the world, right? And so you have a situation even there is not a men's health course that is offered. And so, or there wasn't, at least in the documentation I looked at. And I didn't go through the curriculum as fine tooth comb as Zach Seidler did in that study. But the point is that, how do you prepare the physicians? How do you prepare the health system to receive men in a way that's going to bring them in and keep them in and keep them kind of functioning, and coming back, and that's that context. So I think it's a little bit on the guys, but I think there's a lot of bit on the health system itself too, to make it more friendly and more inviting.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's very insightful that you said that. And that's something I'll be thinking about. I think just to summarize my takeaway is that every man needs to see friendship as essential to his well being and his health. He needs to see the little actions within friendship as the very things that sustain them, and really keep them going, keep the fire alive, and to start to change the normalcy both for you as an individual to say, I'm going to commit these, and just mentioning it. Hey, what'd you do this week? What'd you do this week? Oh, I actually had a doctor's appointment. Everything checked out well. What about you? Just curious, like when's the last time you went to the doctor, right? And starting to normalize it. And then, as a provider in mental health, to be aware of how can I be more understanding of where the average guy is coming in. And then so many more insights. Obviously, I won't bore everyone with recapping, but Dominic, I'm thankful for your time and for sharing all your wisdom. And I'm curious where people can find your work and what you're up to.
So right now I have a Substack page called The Relational Ground, and it's if you look Dominick Shattuck on Substack, you'll probably find me. I have my own small consulting firm, Relational Ground, as well as I'm a faculty in the School of Medicine and the School of Public Health at Johns Hopkins, and this men's health fellow at the American Institute for Boys and Men. I've got a couple of small projects. One's with a group called Futures Without Violence, which is a pretty good, cool group that's doing some work on college campuses right now, and a couple other small things that have been coming up. And I actually, one of my main projects is a women's health project around salpingectomy for ovarian cancer prevention. So we're starting a campaign and kind of normalizing that procedure within the health sector itself. And I hope to take the lessons that I'm working with a physician, Rebecca Stone, who's awesome and super motivated to get this going. And I'm hoping to take some of the lessons I learned from this process and bring them over into the men's health space too.
Yeah,
So
well, you're
yeah.
doing so much meaningful work, and at such a high level, and we're thankful for that. And definitely looking forward to continuing future conversations. And we'll put all that in the show notes. So thank you again, and guys, until next time.
All right. Thank you.